Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding, we, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be, to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This meeting of the Honourable Senate for Friday, the 22nd of May, 2020, is called to order. Brief opening remarks. I just place on record the fact that the country continues to make efforts to deal with the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and the Senate continues to place on record its appreciation to all the persons who are involved in this effort, specifically and particularly persons in the medical field who are considered frontline persons. And of course, we highlight those persons who many of us didn't hear about before, but certainly we appreciate now their role, the persons who are involved in what is referred to as contact tracing. Contact tracing. So we develop a new lexicon around the fight, but certainly we register our appreciation. And of course, we ask God to continue to bless the country and the persons who are burdened with the responsibility for identifying policies and strategies for dealing with the difficulties and the fight against this, what is referred to as an unseen enemy. In my humble view, the country is certainly putting up a valiant effort to restrict the advance of this pandemic and to weigh the various interests in society and to ensure that we can contain this epidemic. So all those who are involved in the fight physically and those who are responsible for the policy and the implementation of the policy, we ask God's continued guidance. Statements by ministers.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I had undertaken to provide an update on the activities of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in respect of Jamaicans overseas. And while I had thought that I might not be able to get that done for this week, I am in fact ready to present such a statement. Mr. President, it bears repeating that the ministry which I am privileged to lead, and I have no myself out. Is staffed by an incredible and, in fact, a remarkable, committed cadre of professionals, both here in Kingston and in our overseas missions. The role and responsibility of the ministry in normal times, Mr. President, includes the most critical function of the support of and assistance to Jamaicans overseas, both those permanently resident who are our diaspora, and those who are temporary and transient travelers. This is a function often taken for granted and not fully appreciated until there is an emergency, when the ministry becomes a valued interlocutor, problem solver, facilitator, care provider, now sometimes even travel agent and social services provider. COVID-19, Mr. President, has brought this into stark focus. Our teams of personnel have risen to this global challenge, and the responsibilities and role that we play is indeed critical, eclectic, multifaceted. It is wide and varied in range and scope, but nonetheless has limitations. I hasten to say, Mr. President, that we are a small ministry. We are, in fact, the smallest ministry across the executive. And the teams in place here and abroad are similarly small, but expectations of us are always great. Mr. President, I share this to underscore the reality we face daily as our teams undertake with tenacity and resourcefulness the defense and support of Jamaicans across the globe. We've continued to work virtually and remotely as required and employed creative ways to get the work done. And Mr. President, this isn't mentioned here, but even where we have had employees who have come down with COVID and have therefore been in isolation, even then they have made efforts to contribute to the support provided for Jamaicans overseas virtually. Mr. President, our foreign service is augmented by a valiant network of honorary consuls, some 90 plus strong, as we've been expanding our team, who volunteer, in fact, perform voluntary duties on behalf of the government of Jamaica. Mr. President, as you know, many Jamaicans were caught overseas when our borders closed in March and have had challenges remaining where they found themselves in certain circumstances. As you may have heard the Prime Minister say on Monday, since the activation of the immigration portal on the JAM COVID-19 website, close to 9,000 Jamaicans have registered to come home under the controlled re-entry protocols. And you would recall, Mr. President, that the re-entry process has, of course, been limited by our quarantine and isolation capacity, and, of course, our underlying and always fundamentally guiding principle of not overwhelming our public health system or our frontline workers. Mr. President, the Jamaicans on the recent flight from the UK, the 2 flights from the USA, and the flight from Canada, the last 3, all taking place on Wednesday the 13th, they're counted among that number of 9,000. So the House will also be aware of 1,044 Jamaicans on the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line vessel Adventure of the Seas, who began disembarking yesterday. They too are among the total, so you may contemplate the number appropriately. Thankfully, Mr. President, therefore, we have been receiving our Jamaicans back on our shores. Mr. President, I must thank here our bilateral partners who have generously assisted in the repatriation and support of some of our nationals. My thanks go to the Government of Canada for allowing free of cost 20 Jamaicans to come home on a charter flight, which was being sent to repatriate Canadian nationals from Jamaica. I acknowledge the cooperation received from the Government of Antigua and Barbuda for facilitating the return of 20 nationals on a repatriation flight they had similarly arranged for their students at UWMONA, which allowed, again, an opportunity for collaboration. And I wish to also acknowledge the TUI Cruise Line for having agreed to provide 7 complimentary seats for the most dire hardship cases among 40 Jamaicans on their charter flight, which brought home 84 of their crew members among several ships including from the Marella Discovery 2. Mr. President, our thanks, and I note that this states 43. It had in fact become 46, if I recall correctly from the last documentation that I had received internally. Thanks also, Mr. President, to the government of the Dominican Republic for their humanitarian gesture in allowing free of cost the return of 2 Jamaicans who had special medical situations. The Cuban government, Mr. President, has also graciously housed in a hotel 2 Jamaican women and a newborn infant until they can be returned, along with a broader group, hopefully very soon, on which we are working. Mr. President, the development and operationalization of the JAM COVID-19 protocols has been one in which I, my permanent secretary, and consular team have been involved with on the back end, ensuring the necessary prioritization and attention is given to hardship cases, especially where the ministry or overseas missions have been working with them even prior to their registration. These Jamaicans are the same individuals which my ministry has been in dialogue with and have supported for weeks and in some cases months, if we also count our hundreds of nationals affected in China from the onslaught of the virus. Mr. President, I wish to briefly detail some of the activities which have been a critical focus. Beginning with the ministry in Kingston, the consular team have fielded hundreds of telephone calls and emails from affected persons and their relatives, seeking advice and assistance, cataloging their needs, and taking action at a granular level to connect and deliver help to persons overseas. We have collaborated, coordinated, and liaised with ministries, departments, and agencies, our diaspora, and other stakeholders in the management of our response to this crisis. Our work has been spread over 40 countries, most directly, and of course indirectly, where you count that we have Jamaicans who have applied from 88 countries across the world. And of course, some have been making moves to come into closer proximity so that when flights are at the ready, that they will be able to get home more quickly. And we are, where possible, assisting in guidance in that regard as well. Mr. President, our focus is generally prioritizes the most vulnerable, those with specific consular needs and demonstrable urgent need to return. Mr. President, in respect of our overseas missions, I'm going to go region by region, not country by country, to give a snapshot, although not an exhaustive account, beginning with North America. You would recognize, Mr. President, that in the United States of America, which is the most popular destination for Jamaicans for tourism, business, study, and transit, there is the largest number of Jamaicans stranded overseas. So our embassy in Washington, D.C., and our consulates general in New York and Miami have used their initiative, their influence, and their networks to support our nationals. Toll-free lines, for example, were established to manage a large volume of calls to, again, give guidance, advice, and recommendations to persons who needed the same, as well as to direct them to persons and to provide assistance where possible. In New York, I make note that through the Consulate General, we identified and paid for accommodation for a number of nationals for several weeks who are homeless or living in particularly vulnerable circumstances. These persons all returned on the last flight, with some exceptions, which I will mention. And I will also just mention, although it is not here, that this required the authorization of emergency release of funds, because this, of course, is not a general, this is not an activity which the ministry is generally funded to do. This is an emergency circumstance. We are not generally funded to provide housing or food for persons overseas in this, certainly not in this type in these numbers. Mr. President, members of our diaspora and diaspora organizations rallied to provide assistance to scores of persons, including students, displaced by the closure of their institutions where they had no family support to assist them with same. Meals and supplies have been collected from generous companies and individuals and continue to be distributed to those in need. And I note as recently as last weekend, Consul General in New York, in conjunction with Grace Kennedy, distributed to a large community base through a Bronx-based church, and our Consulate General provided food for 300 persons on that single occasion. And in fact, this week, I've just been advised they will also, with support from National Bakery, be providing baked goods again in the Bronx to persons who are in need within the community. Our Consul General in New York also successfully negotiated with employers of Jamaican H-2B hotel workers in West Virginia, Utah, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Vermont, who agreed to accommodate them until their return to Jamaica. And in addition, she was also able to secure summer employment for several workers in new hotels reopening so that they can, in fact, remain in the U.S. as they had wanted to do and to continue working in their area of preference, Mr. President. Our Consulate General in Miami has been working with the diaspora in the southern USA to extend assistance in the provision of accommodation, food, personal packages, spiritual and mental health counseling, Mr. President, as they've set up a panel that takes appointments by email, and that information is up on the consulate website, their Facebook page, so it's easily accessible to all who wish. And they're also supporting, of course, logistical arrangements for persons to return home, because as I indicated earlier, sometimes that's a function of persons coming closer to a location from which they can take a flight, as well as working with corporations, civic leaders, community associations, and community support groups offering pro bono services with Jamaican restaurateurs and individuals who have been exceptionally responsive to the community at large. Several restaurants, such as Dutch Pot, D&G, Tropical Oasis, Reggae on the Grill, are deserving of singling out. They continue to provide daily prepared meals to locations of nationals. Grace Food, Mr. President, has donated large amounts of non-perishables, and again, not only in the southern U.S., they've done it in the north as well. Best Dressed Chicken has donated large quantities of chicken parts. Kiwanis Clubs in South Florida, Greater Sunrise and Lauderdale Lakes. The Jamaican Women of Florida, Jamaica United Relief Association, Jamaica Alumni Associations have all provided assistance, and the Sawgrass Inn and Conference Center have even provided hotel rooms where persons have been displaced and needed assistance. Mr. President, we've had a medical practitioner who has consented to work with the consulate to provide telemedicine services on request, and that person has assisted 30 persons. And just as recently as this week, because this is a continuing effort as people's needs change, we have also had a psychologist come on board in the northern U.S. who is also giving counseling services to persons who require, and they make appointments again through the consulate to manage her stream, because this is, of course, voluntary again. And again, it's a demonstration of how our community rallies and how they work with our missions overseas to ensure that the community is served as best as possible. So, Mr. President, I want to acknowledge the incredible coordinated efforts involving mission staff in Washington, New York, and Miami, as well as a Consular Affairs Division at headquarters. And I have to mention myself as well, who was also up at 3 in the morning with them in coordinating the flights out of the U.S. last week, bringing 93 Jamaicans out of New York and 94 out of Fort Lauderdale. These were some of our most urgent cases, Mr. President, urgent cases with vulnerabilities not only among them but among their families here, who were deserving of our assistance and support. So efforts are ongoing, Mr. President, but I have to single out those efforts that took place last week as well. Mr. President, in Canada, our High Commission in Ottawa and our Consulate General in Toronto have also attended to the large volume of inquiries, requests for support and guidance coming from visitors, international students, temporary foreign workers, that is persons on contract, and undocumented Jamaican nationals in that country. The concerns that have been raised by some of these individuals include access to accommodation, food, funds to support a protracted stay, and in this case it's been mostly visitors and students, medical treatment, and in some cases persons who have lost loved ones, and which has proven to take a toll on their mental health and their sense of well-being. Mr. President, the impact on the immigration status for those legally in Canada due to the closure of Jamaica's borders is also a frequent query fielded. And I remind as well, Mr. President, that the ministry had announced previously that we had in Europe, Canada, and the US already ascertained that extensions of visas could be applied for online and in the UK. Apologies for not recognizing the separation there. And we have provided the links, which are still available on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade website, and guidance is available through the ministries. The emergency contact numbers for our missions are all available on the ministry website, mfaft.gov.jm, mfaft.gov.jm, as well as on our social media pages. Facebook is the best one. It's in terms of the ease of location of those bits of information. So the links are there, as well as the information, the contact information if you need guidance because your case is unusual. And I will say that yesterday I participated in a Zoom call with the missions across the US that fielded questions and shared information with more than 300 Jamaicans who either wanted to ask questions about Jam COVID and how it worked, or they wanted to raise questions that they had about their specific visa circumstance, etc. And it was really well done, again, organized as between the embassy in Washington and our consulates general in New York and Miami. Mr. President, I return to the script where I advise that members of the Global Jamaica Diaspora Council, which we formally established in January of this year, members of the Council in Canada, heads of various Jamaican Canadian organizations and churches have been mobilized and coordinated approaches developed to respond to the challenges of our citizens in Canada. And the primary focus has been on rendering temporary relief to Jamaicans in need. And our missions are, for example, working with the community as we speak to host a COVID-19 fundraising telethon next week on the 30th of May to again provide additional resources to those in need. The Jamaica Canadian Association also provides prepared meals to persons in need within the community, and that is work which they continue to do. In the Caribbean region, Mr. President, our High Commission in Port of Spain, which covers 16 territories, has registered and undertaken to assist over 108 stranded nationals, including 42 students, in collaboration with our network of honorary consuls in the region. The registration of stranded nationals, both on land and at sea, is ongoing, and it takes place through a hotline which they've created, social media, and a mailing list through which vital information and guidance has been disseminated. There's been fundraising, donations of cash and kind received from diaspora members, which have been distributed to those in particular need in Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados in particular. And our honorary consuls in Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda have been, and I have to note them for the record, Mr. President, absolute stars in continuing to generously support Jamaicans in these territories. I'm able to advise that I have been in discussions with the Honourable Minister responsible for immigration in Trinidad and Tobago about collaborating on a repatriation flight for our students in Barbados and in Trinidad. The students have indicated that they do not wish to be moved before exams finish, although exams are online, and that goes into, I think they had expressed their preference for June 15, because their exams run up to broadly the 12th to 13th. And so we are working again also with the campuses at St. Augustine and in Barbados, Cave Hill, to ensure that we are all coordinated. I've had discussions with my counterpart, Minister Walcott, in Barbados as well, as we all seek to ensure the best outcomes for our citizens in other Caribbean countries. In Cuba, the embassy has been instrumental in finding housing, meals, and medication for nationals, as well as the provision of additional food and sanitation products for students who are mostly medical students, and where they have requested or indicated needs. And while Jamaica's ambassador to Cuba has provided bleach and other sanitation products in addition to food for students requesting same, the Caribbean Caucus has also been working together to obtain PPE for students. And I'm actually advised, new and breaking, that the PPE which they have ordered isn't just to now being cleared from the ports, and the intention is therefore, it will therefore be distributed among all of the Caribbean embassies in Cuba, and it will be provided to the students who do not seek repatriation to Jamaica, because we are in fact working on the repatriation of a number of stranded Jamaicans, including some students, medical students, at the request of parents of self-funded students who have come together and who we are supporting in arrangements for a flight. They had reached out to a commercial airline, and we had supported them in that regard, and arrangements are now being looked at. They have been flagged as priority within the JAM COVID site, as have been our students in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. And we are working through, as a matter of fact, prioritizing the students in Canada and the US as well, because they have not been sent in a bulk form, so it's difficult to identify them as within their specific capacities to highlight. So that one, especially because of the numbers from the regions, is taking a bit longer, but we have certainly done for our students in the Caribbean. In China, Mr. President, our embassy has provided sterling support to over 600 nationals found across every province in that vast country. That work, I have largely described the role of our embassy there, which has seen our nationals through the phases of unprecedented crisis and continuing their efforts to assist where needed. They are currently facilitating 25 medical students to return to Jamaica as soon as possible, and I will advise that their designated representative, a young lady, she reached out to me personally, and I have written to her as well for her to share with her group the efforts that are being made. They have been prioritized. They actually have indicative dates for a flight. Health has confirmed that quarantine arrangements will be made to accommodate them when they return, and we are working with them to see if we can consolidate their return with the persons in the next group, which I touched on now, Mr. President, and that's in Europe, where our missions in Brussels and Berlin have primarily acted to provide consular support by way of information and tangible assistance to Jamaicans stranded within their jurisdiction of the missions. We've supported some of their own fundraising events as well, and their fundraising efforts online. And these persons largely have been in Belgium, France, Netherlands, Spain, and Germany. I believe we have 2 in Sweden as well. And the missions have rallied members of the Jamaican communities as well to assist our countrymen and women organizing the provision of food and groceries and supplies, prepared meals, travel health insurance in some circumstances where it has been appropriate, medical assistance, including the organization of counselors and mentors to address any emergent emotional issues. Mr. President, in the UK, our High Commission has been fully engaged. I'm sorry, let me just to mention that we're also seeking to consolidate in that group that I referenced with the persons who would be coming from China and Europe, that we would be seeking to bring in the persons who are in Thailand, the UAE, and Kuwait, who have been also identified as persons who are not only in a vulnerable situation, but they need to come closer for consolidation. And we're reaching out to the charter airlines who run through either Belgium or Germany to be able to bring them home. So again, we're all of these efforts, and I have to apologize that sometimes we are so focused on the work that we don't focus on communicating it and sharing it. And that creates a void, which unfortunately is never a positive thing and can be exploited. Mr. President, in the United Kingdom, our High Commission has been fully engaged with Jamaicans stranded there, addressing their needs, and they were instrumental in organizing passengers for evacuation on the TUI flight, as well as, of course, negotiating and arranging the TUI flight with that company. And that, I have to say, was quite a process, and it was not an obvious one in terms of how it worked out, because it essentially, as of the moment that they had accepted their obligations to their employees, they then were intending that they undertake the return whenever commercial flights were to recommence, which was something which we did not find an acceptable arrangement, and therefore Prime Minister Holness had a conversation with then Acting Prime Minister Dominic Raab, which allowed myself and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, aided and assisted by High Commissioner Ahmad, located here in Jamaica, to work together with TUI to shift that position forward, resulting in the return of nationals on the 6th of this month. Mr. President, in South Africa, our High Commission in Pretoria, with the critical assistance of a number of honorary consuls, has been communicating and supporting a number of business persons, missionaries, and tourists, and has even provided warm clothing and groceries to some Rastafarian elders stranded in South Africa, as well as additional funds to help insulate their accommodation, and of course in the one or two of the surrounding countries which that High Commission serves. So, Mr. President, this is not an exhaustive account. Clearly, there are more details to be given in terms of the support, for example, to persons stranded in the Bahamas, to persons in Cayman, to persons in St. Martin, in Anguilla. Mr. President, we celebrate Jamaicans being all over the world, and what a richness that brings to the globe, and what a richness it brings when they return to Jamaica. But it is, in fact, in unprecedented times like this, it is an unprecedented call on the outreach and resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And when I say resources, I don't only speak to the financial, I speak to the emotional part of the human resources, because the consular section, it is the most human part of foreign affairs, and it deals with persons at their most vulnerable. And this epidemic, this pandemic, calls on the staff to go beyond their strict consular remit into various areas of social support for which they perhaps have not even been trained, but is required of them, and in service of the people of Jamaica, they have been drawing on their deepest resources for us to deliver the best possible support to them. It is not a perfect arrangement, and there are certainly gaps because of the sheer numbers and the sheer variety of requirements and demands. But what is clear to me, Mr. President, is that I have one of the best teams that a minister could be blessed with. We work closely together, we work collaboratively together. They know they have my love and support. They know I am with them with the sleepless nights, and sometimes maybe too much. Maybe they prefer a little less, because I say, Minister, where you get your energy from? And I share the vitamins, and which they know some of them take. So, so that we all are moving together, pulling in the same direction for Team Jamaica. So, Mr. President, I thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the ministry's work, which is often overlooked in the broad context of this pandemic. I thank you.
Mr. President,
Thank you very much, Minister. Go ahead, Senator.
yeah. Mr. President, in the absence of the Honourable K.D. Knight, who is the physical absence, that is, of the Honourable KD Knight, who is our spokesperson on foreign affairs.
It is customary for the person who is a spokesperson to respond to the statement and then
I've been deputized.
ask questions. Yes, eh?
I've been deputized. I've been deputized to be the spokesman for the day.
I am aware of that.
Good, thank you. I appreciate. Oops, this goes like this. Yeah. I can't say it was KD who was calling to give instructions. Minister, let me start by thanking you for making this statement. It's kind of long overdue, but we appreciate that it is made. Secondly, we want to place on record the opposition's appreciation of the sterling work being carried out by the staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, locally and abroad. We expect no less of the staff from the civil service, as well as the appointee ambassadors, consular officers, and so forth. It's a duty they owe to our country. It's a duty we pay for, but it's a duty that they carry out, as you say, beyond the call of duty sometimes. So we want to place on record our appreciation for the hard work. It's hard work that they recognize when they took up the job, that there may be emergencies like this. So then they become true interlocutors, problem solvers, facilitators, and care providers. But that's what they are expected to be in situations like this. And we know they've carried out their duties well. Mr. President, the statement from the minister comes at a time when, in a competition of World Cup flags, the flag of Jamaica, minister, came out on top. There are two Caribbean flags in the semi-final, Barbados and Jamaica. The final two flags were South Africa and Jamaica. Both, they look alike in some respect, some similar colors. Oftentimes I think the South Africans took their new flag from the land of Marcus Garvey. But I know, we have to tell them some truth. I have to tell them some truth, that they've taken the colors of their flag in the main from the land of Marcus Garvey. I don't think they'll be offended by the association with Marcus Garvey. So it comes at a time when the pride of our people, despite the impact of the negative impact of the pandemic, is recognized globally. So, President, having traveled on behalf of the country, I know our people abroad. We operate not just as passes, but as a crew that comes together. In Europe, when you go into Geneva, into Switzerland, they come together at the sight of any single Jamaican. And so I expected no less from the diaspora in supporting our people in difficulty in foreign lands. If I should look at the statement, having dealt with that, President, the minister said that there are 9,000 Jamaicans who have registered. Let me, Minister, workers on ships. 2,000 would be pretty easy, to about 25%. Which is why I'm surprised that in the 7th-page statement, there is no mention of the Maritime Labor Convention of 2006 which we ratified. That labor convention of 2006, which Glena spoke to this morning as well, which I have spoken about previously. Sorry? I'm saying it's not in any, no mention of it is in the 7-page statement. That convention imposed an obligation on ship owners to bring our people back home, be it by way of the ships, be it by way of airline tickets, and I would expect, Mr. President, that if they use the airlines, that our people should get a certain standard of transportation. I would have no offense if those planes treated them with some amount of luxury, because certainly cruise lines have treated them with luxury, giving them passengers' cabin to be quarantined in. So I'd have hoped that would demand that the return of our residents not just be no frills, but that they'll be provided with food, and that we insist that they be treated with some amount of luxury, though not first class if you don't want. But the idea that they're not entitled to a luxury return where food is provided to them. So I just say that. The second obligation I want to mention, Minister. And I say, Minister, let me be clear. We're not being contentious here, but I was offended by your comment that is not a luxury flight when the people, our people, complain about food. I was offended, and maybe it's an opportunity not to tear me apart, but to say the comment was taken out of context, and you apologize for making it, because it has offended a lot of people. And it's not being contentious. I'm just telling you, the no luxury flight was offended. It was as offensive as the comment which says that we can't let them loose on the population. And I noticed the Observer had an editorial that addressed both statements. I support the Observer editorial. And I hope that the government, in reflecting, just as the government apologized for what happened by will do the necessary apology to the people. The second limb of the Maritime Labour Convention, why it is so important, is our duty as a country, our duty, our obligation, our responsibility to take in the ship workers. It's not only that the employers must bring them. We have a duty to take them in. So if the employer wants to bring them, but we refuse to take them, we are breaching our international obligation under the Maritime Labour Convention. And that is why, if it's a matter of communication, the communication was terrible. These people on the ships were not communicated in a way for them to know what is being done. The uncertainty, the stress that they were put under was too great and undeserving as Jamaicans, when we have an obligation under the convention that we signed and ratified, the 2006 Maritime Labour Convention, to tell them that we're taking it in, to tell them what we're doing. It's not enough to tell them we were quietly and secretly having discussion from the 21st of April. So it's important, the omission of the Maritime Labour Convention in the context of 25% or thereabout of the people registering is noted in the statement. It's just couldn't make a statement without putting it. Minister, some questions that I think the people of the country may be interested in. Some of the people involved are students. those in Barbados have publicly, or some from Barbados have publicly criticized the government. As some in China before had done, I don't know all the facts, and I'm not going to criticize the government on it. But the fact that they didn't know and they were criticizing us is again a failure of the government to properly communicate to our people in the diaspora as to what was going on. And talking about students, Minister, from your statement...
Sorry, Senator Brown, I take it now that that is...
I'm going to questions. Yeah. From your statement on page 6, you spoke to the work of the embassy in China. This week there was a press story about Jamaicans being abused in China. And this comes against a background of complaints about Africans being maltreated and racist response to them in China. I don't know if your ministry have received any report. If you have, you could share with us on what measures we're taking to mitigate. China is our friend. They ought not to treat our people so if the allegation is true, as our brothers and sisters in Africa have made it clear to them, this is unacceptable. So I raised that about the Chinese. You indicate, Minister, that funds are to be made available to your ministry as an emergency. That's on page 3 of the statement. It said you identified and paid for accommodation for a number of nationals. Can the Minister share with us the total sum allocated for this emergency and how much of that money was spent? Because it can't be that money was sent and we don't know how much and on what it was spent for. The country deserves to know that. So if the minister would be kind enough to deal with that China question and the issue of the funds expended, funds released and that amount expended in this thing. So, in closing, could you tell us also of the other ship workers, what's the timetable for bringing them back? What's the timetable for bringing back the 9,000 who have applied to come back? And I raised these questions about the timetable against the background that the country is told we're going to be reopened on the 1st of June. So I guess immigration officer must go back out. Everybody must go back out. So, but in any event, we're told by some companies that June 4th, tourists will be welcomed back into the country. So if the tourists are going to be welcomed back, does the control return policy, which includes a 14-day quarantine, will that be applied to the tourists who's coming here for 5 days or 7 days of sea, sun, and whatever other S you wish to find? Smoke, yes, smoke. That's a longer one than the one I was thinking of, right? But the issue is, are we reopening to tourists? And does that...
Senator Brown, that's the question. I'm just trying to get it clear. You're asking about the timetable for the persons coming in.
That's one.
That's one. Then you're asking, are we what?
Reopening to the world and to the tourists.
On the 4th
and
of
how does that fit in with the control re-entry policy?
All right.
I'll stop at those. A question that I had written down. One other question. But before I get to that question, allow me, Minister, to join you in congratulating the EU for their continued support to us. I think this week they gave us a number of equipment, and we thank the representatives of the EU. You mentioned in your speech, Minister, telethon to come. The country wants to know what has happened to the telethon that has passed, and what is the status of that resources collected? Have that gone to the frontline workers?
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Senator is quite correct when he notes that the statement has not focused on the ship workers, save to mention, of course, that there are 1,044 aboard the Adventure of the Seas, which is currently 1,056, currently docked at the Falmouth Pier. And accordingly, by Monday, we can say that approximately 50% of the ship workers who work across the globe will have returned home. There is a timeline that is currently being worked on for the next 3 ships which are in queue, and this will be announced in due course. The fact is that I did not include this subject matter in this statement because it is one on which the Prime Minister will update the nation in short order, and in respect of which we are in discussions about a timetable. So for me to make an announcement now would be premature and it would be inappropriate. And so I ask for the Senator's understanding in recognizing that that information will be shared in short order, and clearly all the details that will be allowed to, or that are relevant to that situation, will also be shared as well. We know that our colleague, Senator Samuda, has been literally on the ground and participating in overseeing and implementing the logistics that are part of this extremely resource-intensive process of repatriating our nationals. I think sometimes we don't do the issue credit when we position it as something which is extremely simple and uncomplicated, and you know, the fact that it is not done in the snap of a finger must mean that you are treating it with disregard rather than a healthy respect for the need to bring our nationals home in a safe manner and in a manner which protects the safety of and health of our entire population. So when a ship indicates its willingness to come, but does not give the requisite assurance about timing, which accords with the capacity of the very same public health workers who we support and praise every day, we must ask that they agree with us the arrangements to be made and the timing so that we don't overwhelm our public health system. When a ship indicates that it's willing to come, then, and they don't tell us about their sanitization protocols or the COVID status of their ship, then we must ask for the appropriate information to be provided in due course, again, to ensure the safety not only of the workers coming home, but the very same family and friends and community to which they intend to return. We have had to make sure that we are working on these processes even as the pandemic has unfolded, even as we have been dealing with our outbreaks here. And it's the same public health system. So while we've been working on increasing the capacity, increasing trained personnel to be able to address all of the matters that are relevant, health, security, testing, contact tracing, community oversight, public sensitization, not only to mention where you have had the communities that have been quarantined as a result of outbreaks. These are all matters that have been taking place in parallel and not for any disregard. So we have never refused any ship, let me state that for the record. We have not taken any action which is in breach of the International Maritime Labour Convention. And in fact, it is in fact one of the issues which we raise with the shipping lines, even as we express our appreciation for their adherence to the convention by taking due care of our nationals while they have ceased to operate, and ensuring that they return to their home port as required under the convention. Mr. President, I just want to without going further on that, because as I've stated, the Prime Minister will update on the timelines, but simply to state for the record that the government is working on scheduling the repatriation of the remaining seafarers out there. And again, this is across 9 ship lines, and you know, I would say easily more than 115 ships, some of which are being consolidated even as we speak. And even that, because he's speaking about the mixing of populations, is an issue as between the ships and their respective status. So this is a highly complex matter, and we do our people a disservice when we oversimplify it. So thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to touch very quickly on the matter of the recent press story about the Jamaican in China. And I wish to start by saying, I only wish the journalist had reached out to the ministry to ask if we were aware of this case, or that they had reached out to the embassy, who the young man had stated in his interview did nothing to help him, because they would have had an extremely different set of facts provided to them. Mr. President, I don't wish to go into the details of the case because I don't think it would be appropriate. But I think that it's important that when these stories are carried to the public, that even the most basic of due diligence be done by asking a question. Because the circumstances experienced by the young man, and we cannot comment on how he felt about what was being done, but the embassy provided him guidance, advice which he refused to accept. Mr. President, sometimes circumstances arise which can have different outcomes based on our personal conduct of the matters. And again, in a situation where there are so many circumstances that are legitimately deserving of support, attention, and redress, it's important that the media play their part by asking questions, by checking facts before they put out stories that do not, in fact, reflect the story. So the embassy has been doing their best. More than 600 Jamaicans there, and it's a very small team of 4, and supported by headquarters and the newly established Jamaican Association in China, which has as its president the Asia representative of the Global Jamaica Diaspora Council. Broad support has been given to our Jamaicans, even including care packages with items which we were lucky enough to have left over from the the expo, that was attended by the government delegation in last November. And it's very unfortunate that the embassy's function and capacity was presented in such a negative light when they did everything that they could have. And even the ministry here had supported when the matter came to our attention. So it's truly unfortunate. On the matter of racism, the government of the People's Republic of China has indicated publicly that, that any such actions taken will be punished by force of law. They are not supported, they are not state-sponsored. We have given our students and teachers the guidance to remain within their areas of comfort, you know, the shopkeepers, neighborhoods, etc., that they know, so as to ensure that they're not in vulnerable situations as best as possible. But thankfully, we have not been getting any reports, apart from this gentleman, about Jamaicans who feel that they have been, who have been treated badly as a result of racism. We know that there are persons who have had their pay affected, as have everyone across China. And we understand those situations are being regularized now as the country goes back to normal. And we know that students have had tough situations as a result of the lockdown, but we know that they're all getting back to normal. We know that Jamaicans came home when they felt it was too much, and they are with their families now. And I suppose some are contemplating whether they will return, and others will probably be making arrangements to continue their schooling here. But again, just some research and fact-checking, even the most basic of questions before publishing stories, would help in understanding those circumstances. On the question of the total sum allocated, we have not allocated emergency funding for the pandemic. What we've been doing is asking our missions to indicate to provide a budget based on the needs that have been communicated to them and the circumstances which they have been able to negotiate, whether through Airbnb or through low-budget hotels where the issue is accommodation, and to provide funding for food, again, within circumstances where it has become necessary. So we are provided with a budget which is approved, and we're provided with names and numbers, etc., and then the money is allocated. So at a permission, I would have to get that. I'd have to get where we are today, because it's done per mission and per request. It's not that I've said, here is X number of dollars to be provided, and you spend it as you wish. It's been, we need this, we have this number of Jamaicans who have this particular need. They have lost their contract here, or they've lost their accommodation as a result of X. We have negotiated the cost of whatever per night, and we're proposing X as a cost of food for 3 meals a day. And then on that basis, we approve and allocate. So at another occasion, I can ask my permanent secretary to just provide an up-to-date quantification for that purpose, of the monies expended to date for that purpose. Thank you, Mr. President.
Just a follow-up, President. Minister, would you be kind enough, whether this evening at the press conference or on Monday, to share that information with the nation as to how much we have spent to assist? I don't think it can be a figure that is outside of the grasp of the efficient permanent secretary not to be aware. But in terms of follow-up to things, you said, Minister, that the ships had certain obligations, sanitation, protocols, all of these things. But there are 2 ships, 2 cruise lines involved, the Mariella Discovery 2, which came in, and the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line. Could you tell us which of these 2, because the Royal Caribbean consolidated, could you tell us which of these 2, if any? Well, I know it has to be one or both. Could you tell us which of these are, whether both of these have been derelict, I was going to use another word, derelict in meeting the requirements of the government of Jamaica, which has caused the delay in the return of our citizens? Because it appeared to me, the government saying, in typical Shaggy style, it wasn't me. Then is who?
Mr. President, I did not say the words which appear to have been imputed, or the impression created based on what the senator just said. Let me just make that clear. It is, Mr. President, this is why I have to do my deep breathing before Senate, Mr. President, and I didn't reach all the way to 10. I tried to get to 10.
There was a previous Minister of Foreign Affairs who would have said, no, answer that, but I'm not.
Mr. President.
Exactly where I'm talking.
Mr. President, I am not alleging that any cruise line in particular has been recalcitrant in providing the information. There have been discussions, negotiations, and requests, and the information does not always come within the time that is requested. Some things, so Mr. President, and of course you recognize that the circumstances are also entirely different as between the shipping lines just mentioned. Mr. President, I had indicated that the intention was not to focus on the shipping lines today for obvious reasons. And I don't wish to be drawn into any fine points which will then be exploited at any later occasion. The fact is, and as the Prime Minister has made clear, that we have been in negotiations with the shipping lines for the return of our nationals. We have been in negotiations. I simply shared some of the elements which are required for our certainty and around the safe return of our nationals and their repatriation. I did not make any allegation in respect of any line, and these I sought merely to explain the complexity of the discussions that have had to take place and that continue, and not with 2 shipping lines, but across, I think it is approximately 10 shipping lines with whom we have had to be engaged across more than 100 ships. So I share, Mr. President, the complexity of the issue, and not to allege any recalcitrance or breach, although the complexity itself speaks for the opportunity for delay.
President, I thank the Minister for saying none of the 2 lines that I mentioned were involved. I thank her for saying that. Unfortunately, if someone look back at answered the audio tape or the audio visual tape, they may draw a different conclusion. But that's for them. I don't want to go there. I just want to make it clear, Mr. President, that as we go forward and the government, the opposition lends you our support, it's important that we communicate clearly and precisely so people can understand. It's also important, Mr. President, that in so doing, we recognize the importance to our democracy of a free press. The barring of the press at airports and seaports cannot be good for democracy. And the support,
Mr. President,
the support we offer the government, including utmost respect for the democratic process of our country. Freedom of the press, freedom of the press, freedom of the press.
On a point of order, what is freedom of the press? On a point of order, Mr. President.
Senator Brown, thank you.
The senator is misleading the Senate, as the press have not been barred from any area of any of the ports, whether air or sea, that they would normally have access to, Mr. President. They have no access to the areas on any normal day that they have not been allowed access to now. And furthermore, Mr. President, these areas are akin to being admitted to a hospital as people are kept in quarantine, whether at home or in the government. They have no right, and privacy of people must be protected, Mr. President. The press have not been barred, and that was a misleading statement and must be withdrawn.
Mr. President.
Freedom of the press. Freedom of the press.
Senator,
Withdrawn, Mr. President, because this is inaccurate.
the point of order. The point of order. The point of order has been. The point of order. The point of order has been heard and clearly accepted by the Speaker because he's not continuing. Senator Crawford.
Yes, sir. Mr. President, we were exposed today to a statement from the Minister, in particular the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as it relates to foreign nationals being returned. It is therefore, I believe, Mr. President, not within the...
Sorry, just by way of guidance, not foreign nationals.
Sorry, Jamaican nationals, being returned. It is therefore, in my opinion, Mr. President, not within the ambit of the Minister to suggest that the ships are not for consideration or conversation today, because on those ships are Jamaican nationals seeking to be returned. I am somewhat as well, Mr. President.
Senator Crawford, you have to ask a question, you know.
I I'm asking. No, no, no. Well, let me ask a question, Mr. President. Let me ask a few questions, Mr. President. The first question I would like to ask, Mr. President, is if the minister is aware of the level of anxiety being experienced by persons. I want to ask my question. You said I should ask my question. Allow me.
Senator Crawford, address me.
Yes,
the
Mr.
first
President.
question you want to ask is
Yes,
if the
I have a
minister
few
is
questions.
aware
First,
of the
is the
anxiety.
minister aware of the anxiety being faced by those who are stuck at sea?
Minister cannot speak on somebody's
Well, the minister could have been made aware by a medical practitioner. So therefore, the minister's awareness isn't based on her own knowledge. The minister could have been made aware. Is the minister also aware?
Senator Crawford. Senator
On a point
Crawford.
of order, Mr.
Yes.
President.
Have a seat for me, please.
On a point of order, Mr. President.
Sorry, no, please, just allow me. No, Senator Crawford, sit down good now, please. Look here, the member is entitled to ask the minister questions which are relevant and within the purview of the minister. So he is entitled to do so without interruption. Yes, Senator Crawford.
Thank you, sir, because if the minister is so aware,
Senator Skeffrey, the member is entitled to ask the question without interruption. It's a point of order, Senator Crawford. Yes?
Mr. President, because the comment, even from yourself, the questions that are allowed are stated in the standing orders. And if I were to refer to the standing order, which is 16G8, Mr. President.
Senator Crawford, sit down properly, please.
Which says that you can ask questions, it limits the questions to asking whether statements in the press of private individuals or unofficial bodies are accurate. No, that you cannot ask those questions. So, how are you asking a question? How does he ask a question? On what basis is that question being asked?
Okay.
Of the person's medical position.
Give it to me.
Anxiety. Come on, man.
Look, let me tell you something. The standing orders are clear and the member no doubt is aware of them, but there is an ultimate sanction because the minister in her intelligence may choose to answer the question or not. Proceed.
Yeah, but Mr. President, with due respect, Mr. Minister, Mr. President, in answering my colleague's question, the minister stated that the Prime Minister at his time will answer 2 questions about the ships. Now, if there is an acknowledgement of anxiety, then that cannot be a reasonable statement. When we are hearing that persons are killing themselves on the ship, have you heard that? We are hearing that persons are jumping over into the water. How can it not be an appropriate
On a point of order, Mr. President. On a point of order. No,
if those questions
Damien.
are known? If the answers are known by the minister, then the minister should be willing to provide those answers with immediate effect.
Senator
not waiting
Crawford.
on the Prime Minister to have his press conference.
Senator Crawford.
That is not a reasonable position.
Senator Crawford. Senator Crawford.
Full question at the end.
Senator Crawford.
You stand up while I stand
Senator
in.
Crawford.
I'm saying that
Senator
the Prime
Crawford.
Minister's
Senator
purview
Crawford.
of when he wants to do his PR announcement
Senator
is not
Crawford.
a reasonable way
Senator
for
Crawford.
people who want information
Senator
now.
Crawford.
I'm saying that
There's a point of order you
by
need to
who?
take.
Because there's no order over there.
Senator
So they're
Crawford.
disrupting the question.
Senator
point
Crawford,
of order,
there's a
Mr.
point of
President.
order.
You taking it, Charlie?
It's a misleading statement to say that persons are killing themselves on with
But
ship.
I must tell you that I haven't
It's
heard the
ridiculous.
question. I haven't heard the question.
There's no, where's the evidence of that?
Senator,
You must
Senator,
read, man. Where
no,
is the evidence
Senator
of that?
Crawford, you can't do that. There's a point of order. I need to rule on it. You can't be just jumping up like that. 1 minute. Senators, you had something to say.
The assertion and the comments made earlier were misleading the Senate and bringing the Senate into disrepute, Mr. President, and rule on the matter.
Senator Crawford.
The statement made by Senator Crawford in his question about persons dying on ship and jumping off is misleading the Senate as it has no relation to Jamaicans on board, and it is misleading and bringing the Senate into disrepute and must be withdrawn, Mr. President. I await your ruling.
Senator Crawford, you are required to ask the minister a question. That is what you are entitled to do. You are embarking on a frolic of your own, and I'm not going to allow it. If you have a question to ask the minister, ask.
Mr. President, I never noted where the persons who have been injured are from.
But I've never asked you anything about that. I say if you have a question to ask,
Mr. President,
ask
let
it.
me answer to you, sir. Mr. President.
Answer to me. Ask the minister a question.
In the statement, the minister says that the ministry becomes valued interlocutor, problem solver, facilitator, and care provider. And it mentioned as well psychological impacts that have been faced. So if it is that it is within this statement.
So what is the question?
Well, I'm saying, sir.
No, I don't want to know what you are saying. I want to know what you're asking. What is the question?
I am asking why should the persons facing anxiety for information
Mr. President,
wait on the Prime Minister to speak
a point of order,
Mr. President.
If the minister
have the answers to the question asked by Senator Brown. Senator Brown says,
thank you.
When?
A point of order, Mr. President.
I hear the question. Point of order. I hear the question.
Speaking as a professional who deals with anxiety, Senator Crawford, let me clarify the point of order.
Senator Longmore.
The point of order is that the senator is requesting of the minister to answer something that she cannot. Because that in a professional capacity, you cannot stand at a distance.
Interrupt a point of order with a point of order. Wait it a bit, no man.
But that's not a point of order.
I will make that decision,
You cannot request of the minister to make aspersions regarding diagnosis without the necessary conduction for such diagnosis. And such cannot be pursued remotely. So there is no way that the minister can provide such an answer at this time.
Thank you. So the question, as I understand it, Minister, is why are you not speaking to the anxiety of the status of the passengers and you are leaving it for the Prime Minister to answer?
But, Mr. President, I'm not finishing.
What do you mean you're not finished? You ask a question.
No, I have questions, Mr. President.
I'm taking the question one at a time. So the first question is why are you leaving it to the Prime Minister to discuss?
But, Mr. President, with due respect, Mr. President, Senator Brown was allowed to ask all his questions.
But he was putting them in a succinct manner. You're not doing that.
Yeah.
So if you ask them in a succinct way...
I'm not being allowed to speak, Mr. President. I'm not being allowed to be any type of inked at all. Right? So, therefore, Mr. President...
All right, so here, listen to it now. I hear what you are saying.
Yes.
So the first question you asked it already. What is the second question you want to ask?
Okay, Mr. President, thank you very much. I want to know from the minister, when was the minister herself or the government aware that there were persons, Jamaican nationals, stuck at sea on cruise ships in particular?
Good. That's question number 2.
Right.
Number 3 now.
No,
you see, Senator Brown, you are interrupting the question, I know.
Question 3, sir.
Go on.
Would it be reasonable, Mr. President, I'm asking the minister, would it be reasonable for the public and the Senate to assume that at latest the government was aware on the 2nd of April that Jamaicans were stuck at sea?
Number 3. Senator Fraser Binns. Senator Fraser Binns. All right, Senator Crawford, you asked the question, right? Listen to the answer here now, rather than engaging Fraser Binns.
Mr. President, without seeking to express any medical opinion, it is clear that the government, whether through the Prime Minister, myself, or other representatives, have expressed our concern that nationals overseas must be experiencing anxiety. And this has been expressed publicly in respect of our nationals at sea and at land. We have expressed our concern about this, and we have asked for patience and understanding because of the number of persons and the fact that repatriation requires logical, controlled, and phased re-entry that does not overwhelm our public health system. We have
said that before.
Yes,
okay.
so I am repeating that, Mr. President. It has been stated in different fora, and I wanted that, therefore, to be clear. My reference to my exclusion of a broad reference to nationals at sea was because, and I explained it in my response to Senator Brown, that the Prime Minister will
with the
speak in
greatest
more
of respect,
detail.
you said that already, you don't have to
Yes,
say it
Mr.
again, so
Mr.
they can
President,
ask the question. All
it-
you have to say is you're not answering that.
Thanks, Mr. President. I'm making it clear. I'm making it clear for the record, Mr. President. And why I'm making it clear, Mr. President, is because I do not wish there to be room for misinformation and mischief. Because, Mr. President, even as the opposition is calling for unity in one breath, they are, through statements such as just made by Senator Crawford in the guise of a question, creating mischief and causing for spreading of misinformation.
No. Mr. President, Mr. President, point of order.
Mr. President,
Point of order.
1 minute. What's the point of order? Senator Fraser Binns, point of order.
Mr. President, the minister, who is normally very measured in her words, have said something to which I must take offense. Mr. President, I'm speaking to you. Yes. Mr. President, for the minister to say, Fraser Binns, for the minister to say that the opposition has been making statements which do not help the process, I think that is irresponsible, and I think she ought to withdraw it. The opposition, Mr. President.
All right. 1 minute.
Mr. President.
The point of order being?
The point of order is that she is offending Standing Order 35. She is imputing motive, and she needs to withdraw it.
Mr. President,
The mic.
sorry, no, disrespect.
The observation frame does not in itself amount to a point of order, but I have heard the observation, and no doubt the minister has, and as someone who you pointed out uses her words in a very measured manner, I ask her to continue.
No, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President, because
Mr.
certainly taking my words out of context when explaining about refreshment on a flight, speaking about people jumping off ships where, and I will just state for the record because I think it is irresponsible. I know there is a video being circulated on social media by a member of this Honourable Senate, and it has been further circulated by others, which has, and let us call it an informal conversation with somebody who makes allegations about Jamaicans jumping off ships and committing suicide, which does nothing but cause anxiety.
Mr. President, no, Mr. President,
that are here. And it
Mr.
is
President, Mr. President,
it is irresponsible.
Mr. President, on a point of order.
No, Mr. President,
Mr. President,
it is irresponsible.
Mr. President,
And in fact, I
Mr.
think,
President.
I actually
Mr.
think the
President,
constabulary,
order.
should look
Order,
into
Mr. President.
whether it rises to public
Mr.
mischief,
President.
for
Mr.
which
President.
it should be charged and prosecuted.
Mr. President, point of order.
You
Mr.
think it's a
President.
joke? People
Point
don't
of
take
order.
these
Thank you,
things
Minister.
seriously.
Thank you, Minister. There is a point of order.
Yeah, because let me tell you something. No, me have my point of order. Because this constant hiding behind.
No, Senator
Yes, Mr.
Crawford.
President.
What is the point of
The
order?
minister,
What is the point
the
of order?
minister suggested untruthfully that I said Jamaicans were jumping off ships.
She never said that.
She said,
Senator,
she said
she
that
did not. Minister,
Minister,
Senator
Mr.
Crawford.
President, the
Senator Crawford.
No, well, Mr. President, let me make it clear. There is reports in the media of individuals working on a ship.
Senator Crawford, if you have a point of order, make it. I never heard the minister say that, you know. I heard the minister say that there is no insinuation is not going to help me now.
In this house.
All right, Senator Crawford. She never said that.
All right, can I have my questions answered then, sir?
Minister, continue with the question, please.
Thank you,
With the
Mr.
answer.
President. Mr. President, I just to say that, you know, it is unfortunate when things are said and done. You know, I recall even when the outbreak was taking place in Wuhan, all the way earlier this year, in January, it seems so long ago. And there were students who were so distressed that persons were spreading things which were not true, which were causing their families distress. So they had to be expending emotional energy that they needed to keep their own self together and in a good positive frame of mind, to be trying to calm their parents at home because of things that they were hearing. And I just think we have got to be responsible. We've got to be responsible. Mr. President, my counterpart on an interview, even if it was last night, the night before, was again repeating that as if it were a fact that the government is disjointed because Minister Tufton said he didn't know a ship was coming. Even after we had clarified that no one expected a ship to be coming because we were in negotiations, and yet it's put forward as and positioned as some sort of, you know, it's mischief causing, it's taking matters out of context. Taking matters out of context and creating mischief. And it is not helpful in a crisis. It creates anxiety for people who legitimately otherwise have concerns. And it is just really, really, really sad, Mr. President. Really, and Mr. President, I just want to say that in respect of the specific question about being aware of nationals at sea, I cannot give a specific date to that.
President, I asked a second question. I asked a question if it is reasonable to assume that at latest, the 2nd of April, when the Marilla communicated, the government was aware that there were persons stuck at sea. Is it reasonable to assume that when you got a report that there were some stuck at sea, that you were then aware? Is it reasonable?
Mr. President, I cannot say what he may deem to be reasonable or not, but certainly we were aware by the call of the Marella that, right through the ship's agent, that there were seafarers, Jamaican seafarers at sea.
Thank you. Next
Thank
question.
you, sir. Now, in the statement, the minister suggested that at the 21st of April, conversations were being had with the, well, in a statement, conversations were being had with the cruise ship lines. Is there a reason between the 2nd of April and 19 days later, the 21st of April, why there was this delay before communication was engaged with the cruise ships?
Mr. President, I'm not even clear on what he's asking because it's different shipping lines, different negotiations, different discussions, different circumstances entirely. So I'm not clear on what comparison it is he's seeking to make. I'm not clear on the question.
Mr. President, I can be corrected, Mr. President.
Senator Brown and Senator Fraser-Binns are trying to assist you. Just
no,
take
fine.
a deep breath and ask the question you want to ask.
Well, Mr. President, it is...
Don't allow that. I'm not allowing that. Ask the question that
Mr.
you have to
President,
ask.
It was suggested in this House that engagement with cruise lines in general started on the 21st of April. The minister, and well, you can correct yourself when you're your time. The minister also suggested, Mr. President, that they would have been aware at latest on the 2nd of April. I'm asking why was the delay for 19 days later, and if that is not so, when did communication and engagement start with the shipping companies as it relates to carrying home our nationals to Jamaica?
Mr. President, again, I will just repeat that the matters are entirely, the senator is conflating issues, which is making it difficult to render an accurate answer because there is no accurate question. The first point that I want to make is that the government has not said that it started negotiations with the cruise lines on the 21st. What we did clearly state is that our first formal communication with the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line, which owns the ship currently in port in Falmouth, was on the 21st. So our first formal letter to RCCL asking for exploration of ways in which we can repatriate our nationals was on the 21st. That is a particular cruise line, a particular letter.
But I understand that.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am not clear on what else he is asking because the truth is, I know I've been clear earlier in stating that we've been dealing with more than 10 shipping lines that have more than 100 ships all over the globe, and I'm talking from Australia literally to the Norwegian Sea, and with Jamaicans on them. And if it is that the senator cannot understand that it would take time, that you respond to, not only respond to requests, but you make outreach, and you're dealing with an entire outbreak here. If he cannot understand the complexity of what I have explained earlier, then there is no answer that I can give today that will help him.
Senator, you want to move on?
Yes, sir, because I need more understanding, sir. I need greater understanding. So, Mr. President, consistently I hear the minister speak to 10 cruise lines and 100 and whatever, more than 100 ships, right? Seeking to give the impression of the difficulty of the task. Has the government taken the direction of speaking to the 100 ships or speaking to the 10 cruise lines? I would like to know that because the minister continue to speak to, clearly. The minister seems like she have complicated it by speaking to the 100 ships instead of speaking to the 10 cruise lines to organize the 100
Thank you very much. You have another question?
So the complication seems to be a government-centered complication.
Senator Crawford. All right. Any other questions? Senator Skeffrey.
No, the President ruled.
Senator Skeffrey. Senator Skeffrey.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to shift the focus from the ship, so I'm not going there. The statement spoke about 9,000 Jamaicans that have registered to return home under this control protocols. My question is from this number, Minister. I have a keen interest for our students. From this, how many are students? So how many students have so registered to return home? And secondly, how many students have returned home thus far by way of the government's initiative? So I want to clear that. You spoke about the Cubans. You spoke about the Cubans students. And I know of a number of students in Cuba. Some I've taught while I was in the classroom. And they have reached out their parents and so on. But you spoke generally about returning them home. And I ask this in the context, not just Cubans, but students generally just going to international, study internationally, and it's a challenge, losing the part-time work, and it has impact. So what, in terms of how many students in Cuba, for example, are we working on to return home with this special commercial airline? And why is it taking, what are the challenges? Why you can't give a specific timeline? Or may I ask, what is specific timeline to return these students? Cuba is probably naturally the closest neighbor. And it might be complex, but for me, to organize a chartered flight to take our students home, to me can be a complex matter.
Senator Scaffery, very concise and clear question.
So I have 2 or 3, and I have 2 follow.
Minister Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would have to check how many students have applied and how many are brought in, because they don't apply as a category. You don't apply as a student. Jamaicans apply, and then it's within the context of your circumstances that we are able to assess. So I would have to research that and come back to you. It's not like we're a body of persons, such as the members of a ship, apply, and you're able to search for them as a group because of the category in which they fall. But, Mr. President, I want to just indicate in respect of Cuba, the last number that I had of students who are seeking to return by virtue of the flight that's being arranged is 49. That's the last number that I had. But understand that with these circumstances, you sometimes have shifting numbers as people change their minds. Sometimes they decide to stay. Sometimes there are additional persons who decide to come. And it's an overall group of 55 because there are also some Jamaicans who had been traveling who are stranded there as well. So the number that we're working with for this flight is 55. And as I indicated, that they have they've been flagged as a priority, and we're working with health to agree a time at which they can be accommodated, because now the flight arrangements are close to complete. So that is actually one of our matters at hand. The students as a whole, that again I can't give a number, and just to indicate that in terms of, you seem to be asking why they haven't been brought home yet, if at this, given their geographic proximity. The issue being that we have had to prioritize, because as I've said at the outset, the fundamental is our quarantine and isolation capacity. And therefore, what we tried to do was bring in our most dire hardship cases. So even in Cuba, where persons express, and you have seen it in the statement put out by the scholarship students, we know that the Cuban government had been working very hard to protect the interests of our Jamaicans there, and the embassy was working to support where those gaps existed. So far as it was our understanding, they were all provided with accommodation. They had food, even if it is that some of them didn't like the food, and there were challenges in terms of, because it just seemed to focus on that issue, and that there are certainly issues in respect of anxiety about the situation in Cuba that they self-funded students expressed. The scholarship students were an entirely different category and had a different approach. And as a government, we not only had to work through those circumstances, but also ensure that we were assuring the Cuban government, who, of course, as you are aware, have provided us with more than 100 workers to support our COVID, healthcare workers to support our COVID response, that they too, they were a bit concerned about some of the reports that were in the media here that seemed to be stating that the government was not in fact carrying out their responsibilities towards our students. And we certainly would not have wished to give that impression either, because we know that it is not what, certainly what would have been intended. So we've been managing that circumstance from a bilateral relation as well as with the actual priority of needs. And again, as I shared publicly in another space recently, the persons who came home on the most recent flights that we organized were persons in the most dire of circumstances. We're speaking of persons who are being treated for cancer. We're speaking of persons who lost children, grandchildren, persons who themselves were separated from persons who they give care to in Jamaica and who are now in vulnerable situations, to whom they needed to return to give care, persons who no longer had a roof over their head, and that the government was now paying for them to be in low budget accommodation, persons for whom we were providing food subsistence. So where the students are accommodated and are receiving 3 meals a day, they were not going to be received before persons who did not have those circumstances. And that is how we have had to manage in terms of prioritizing our repatriation.
The President, so follow up on this one. So, Minister, would I be correct if I draw the conclusion that as of today, the government doesn't have a specific timeline in terms of when it wants to return to all our students, especially those that the parents are stressed and have the anxiety that you just spoke about? Because the statement is, in my mind, is still general. What I want to, and the mothers and fathers out there would want to be clear that my son and my daughter will return by mid-June, end of June. So we have some timeline to manage the stress, Senator Longmore. But if you just have it in limbo, then it continues to linger on. So what I want from you as the minister, to give us a timeline, despite the challenges and the priority listing. Because even as a priority listing, you have priority A, B, C, and D, and you must reach D at some point in time. So we have started this priority listing from March. We are coming to the end of May. So where are we along the priority listing? How many priority listings you have? And worst case scenario, when will we bring home all our students that have expressed the desire to return home? 1st of September, December for Christmas, we need to know. So let's be specific to the country and start speaking these general terms, because we all understand that COVID presents unusual circumstances. We all understand that. And we all can use the notion that there are complex issues. But amidst the complexity, Mr. President, we need to put a plan and share it with the country.
Senator Skeffel,
as we want.
We're running a bit long on this, but I
get the question. I have two closing questions.
I hear the question you just asked the Minister. Can you give a timeline as to when all the students will be at?
Regretfully, I cannot, Mr. President.
Okay. You spoke about in follow-up on the question that Senator Brown asked about the money allocated, and while you spoke about different budgets and so on. But as I understand, budgeting and money is never unlimited. Has the ministry put aside a specific sum, allocated a sum for this initiative? Of course, if you need more, you will go to the Ministry of Finance. But is it that everybody does send in a budget, and how do you guide them? As I understand budgeting, so you ask somebody to give a budget, but you don't want unusual expectation. So is it that you have 10 million, 20 million for these initiatives thus far? When you have exhausted it, then we know where next to go. And the final one for me, and the issue of the telethon. You spoke about having another one.
Sorry, on the instance of what?
The telethon. Yeah, you spoke about having one to gain.
That's not within the ministry.
Yes, in the statement. Yeah, man. The minister is organizing one for fundraising. Yes. Yeah, the minister said it in the statement. Organize. Mr. President, I will not divert. No. But what I'm saying, to get the confidence of us all to buy into this one again. We had one recently, and to the best of my information, we have not presented a report to the country as to how much total earn, the expenditure, and so on. So if you want this to be a feature for fundraising, when you have them, we must present a comprehensive report. So I ask, to you, Mr. President, to the Minister, where are we with the issue of accountability and transparency in terms of the expenditure statement and the previous one to the people of Jamaica?
Thank you, Senator Scarfer. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me first say that while I've been here, I was able to confirm that the amount which has been provided to missions in Washington, New York, and Miami is the equivalent of 30,000 United States dollars. So not a profligate amount in the circumstances. In total, and that has been accounted for based on requests, quantification of need, and our assessment and approval of that circumstance done at the technical level. I had only given the policy approval for this to be implemented. That is, that we did need to allocate unusual expenditure. There is no specific budget for emergency response, and that is the answer to that question. In respect of the telethon, which has been organized by, the organization for which has been led by the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, I know she gave a statement to the House some time ago, which had reported on the initial earnings at the time, which was 50 million. And I know the ministry had been mobilizing to use the content to seek to raise additional funding. And so I will ask her to provide an update on that matter to the public of Jamaica, I presume to the other place in which she serves at the appropriate time. The telethon to which I referred to is being organized in Canada by the Jamaica Canadian Association, other diasporic associations, supported by and endorsed by our High Commission and consulate there.
Thank you, Minister. Announcements?
Laid on the table of the House today, laid on the table of the Senate today are the following. Annual Report of the National Products Limited, NPL, for the year 2018-2019. National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Silver Sun Housing Development Order.
I'm sorry, Madam Clerk. You need to start again because you do not have the attention of the members of the Senate who seem to be intent on grumbling while you are speaking. So please continue. Go ahead, please, Madam Clerk. Please start from the start.
Today, a copy of the following. Annual Report of the National Products Limited, NPL, for the year 2018-2019. National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Silver Sun Housing Development Order 2020 under the National Housing Trust Act. National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Ruthven Towers Housing Development Order 2020 under the National Housing Trust Act.
Thank you very much. Bills brought from the Honourable House of Representatives.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the Honourable Senate. I have the honour to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 19th day of May 2020, a bill entitled An Act to Protect the Privacy of Certain Data and for Connected Matters was passed in the House of Representatives. Signed, Pernell P. Charles, CD, JPMP, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Who's taking charge of the bill? Who is taking charge of the bill?
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the bill.
Thank you, Minister.
A bill shortly entitled the Data Protection Act 2020 read a first time.
Mr. President, I ask for second reading of the bill.
Thank you very much, Minister.
I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, motions that may be made, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice that at the next sitting of the Senate, I will move the following motions. Be it resolved that the National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Silver Sun Housing Development Order 2020 under the National Housing Trust Act, which was laid on the table of the Senate on the 22nd day of May 2020, be referred to the Regulations Committee of the Senate for consideration and report. Be it resolved that the National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Root Vent Towers Housing Development Order 2020 under the National Housing Trust Act, which was laid on the table of the Senate on the 22nd day of May 2020, be referred to the Regulations Committee of the Senate for consideration and report. Mr. President, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take these motions.
Thank you very much, Senator Williams. Questions and answers to questions? Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, while it feels like we have already had a full debate in this chamber, it in fact remains for us to take the sole item on the agenda of public business for today, which is the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Financial Holding Companies Order Resolution 2020.
You weren't going to deal with Senator Williams' motion? But you said that it's only one item of business here. So you can take it after. Yeah. And that will ensure that he remains with us anyway.
Mr. President, the resolution just mentioned will be followed by us taking the resolution of which Senator Williams just gave notice. Mr. President, today I seek the affirmation of the Senate of the Terrorism Prevention Designated Reporting Entity Financial Holding Companies Resolution Order 2020. The resolution seeks to give effect to the accompanying order dated May 6, which in turn imposes certain reporting obligations on financial holding companies under the Terrorism Prevention Act 2005 as amended by the Terrorism Prevention Amendment Act 2019, which we passed in November last year. Mr. President, in 2017, we affirmed resolutions in similar terms in respect of real estate dealers, casino operators, accountants, some gaming operators. In November 2019, a fifth order was affirmed in relation to attorneys at law practicing in Jamaica and carrying out certain activities on behalf of their clients. And the order before us today will then be the sixth in this regime under the TPA. Mr. President, I'll give some background to the resolution, which will in some ways serve as a reminder of the context within which the earlier orders were passed in this chamber. Mr. President, Section 15.2 of the Terrorism Prevention Act provides that certain entities must determine on a continuous basis whether they are in possession or control of property owned or controlled by or on behalf of a listed entity. And I remind this House that a listed entity is a designated terrorist entity, so designated by the UN Security Council or by order of the Supreme Court. And members of this Honourable Chamber would recall the discussions that we had about that and the amendments we made to expand the process by which that can be undertaken. Mr. President, the entities that must continuously make this determination are: 1, foreign companies doing business in the financial sector in Jamaica, and it's in relation to banking, securities, insurance, investment advice or trusts, and this is under Clause 15.2a, Jamaican financial institutions at large, and that's under 15.2b, as well as entities designated by the Minister by order under 15.2c. So, Mr. President, it's intended today to bring financial holding companies under the Terrorism Prevention Act regime, pursuant to 15.2c, as entities which have corporate responsibility for the development and implementation of group-wide anti-money laundering or terrorist financing prevention, policies and procedures for the group of companies for which the entity forms part. This will essentially, Mr. President, mirror the category set out in paragraph 1.1a of the 4th schedule of the POCA. Mr. President, Section 15.3 and Sections 16.1 to 16.3 of the Act stipulate additional reporting obligations regarding property held by listed entities, complex, unusual, or large transactions, and transactions suspected to be for the benefit of a terrorist group or listed entity. And by way of a reminder, Mr. President, the UN list of designated terrorist entities is available under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and it is kept current. Mr. President, the importance of this matter to us, before us today, has been affirmed by the Bank of Jamaica. The Bank of Jamaica is the designated competent authority under both the POCA and the TPA for deposit-taking institutions under the Banking Services Act. So commercial banks, merchant banks, building societies, as well as cambios, credit unions, remittance agents, and agencies. So the BOJ has advised that their new rules promulgated under the Banking Services Act now allow for full regulatory regime of financial holding services to be fully implemented. Save, however, Mr. President, that designation under the TPA is also required to give this, this element its due accord. The Bank of Jamaica also monitors FHCs already in respect of group-wide AML CFT policies, anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism policies and procedures. However, the specific reporting obligations provided for under the TPA are also required for them to ensure the most effective regulation and monitoring framework. So designation by way of this order will create those obligations. Also, Mr. President, also importantly, affirming this order will be another action demonstrating Jamaica's commitment to the international standards set by the Financial Action Task Force and, of course, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which is a regional monitoring organization. More directly, the order needs to take effect and to be implemented as part of the framework through which Jamaica will ensure it continues to meet its international obligations. As we're now aware, Mr. President, despite significant legislative and administrative reforms to Jamaica's AML CFT regime, implemented even as recently as last year when we sought to complete all of the tasks that were needed as a result of the 2015 assessment, which had generated the 2017 report under which work was being undertaken. So, Mr. President, notwithstanding all that work, further to a new threshold put in place based on size of economy by the FATF, Jamaica was moved into a category of countries under the direct monitoring of the FATF. So no longer CFATF monitored, we are now directly FATF monitored, which has a different scope of obligations and of assessment. So on the 21st of February of this year, the FATF, during its plenary meeting, placed the country on its grey list, as we're all aware, and the minister, I believe, Minister Clark, gave a statement to the House on this very early in its in its nascence. In response to that placement, Mr. President, the country agreed to a time-bound action plan to address the deficiencies identified and the tasks to be accomplished. Jamaica also gave a high-level political commitment to complete the action plan within the agreed timelines, and that is by September 2021. But we start now. An interagency task force, which is coordinated by the Bank of Jamaica and chaired by the Ministry of Finance, by the minister himself, in fact, is now directing activities under the plan of action to ensure that all deficiencies are dealt with in a timely manner. Affirmation of the order before us today comprises one of the actions to be taken. So, Mr. President, I'll just very briefly turn to the resolution and order, the scope of which I've already explained. Simply to note that it will take effect when the order is affirmed by both Houses of Parliament and gazetted, and also that, of course, the designation will make reporting entities liable to report also to the FID whether they are in possession or control of property owned or controlled by or on behalf of listed entities. And as explained earlier, the listed entities are all on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. I believe it's on. It's also available through others, through other websites, but we can attest to this one being kept current. Mr. President, having given the background to the order and a synopsis of its effect, and having emphasized the importance of its implementation, I now invite members of this Honourable Senate to support the resolution before us. I thank you.
Thank you. Ministers invited. Comments? Any presentation? Senator Brown.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Minister.
President. Mr. President, when the clerk sent out the agenda for today, I recognize that there's really one substantive issue, which was the small order. And therefore, I thought that with a Senate starting at 10 o'clock, by 11 o'clock, we'd all be gone.
Make it to 1 o'clock if you move quickly into the substance of your presentation.
I have no such plan to move quickly, sir. Suffice it to say that the opposition supports the order. As the minister said, it's the sixth in a series of such orders taken. I recall the last set, there's some rush, some urgency involved. And we did make the comment then that we believe we should set out a timetable of the things that must be done. The minister said there's more action to be taken going into 2021. And it would be good if you could share with us here and in the other place that set of thing, so we could help remind you and your hard-working staff who's taken up a lot with COVID, that the timetable approaches, that the time frame in which action must be done approach, so that we can be part of the monitoring of doing what needs to be done to keep Jamaica in good grace. You might have alluded to it, Minister, but it wasn't clear, that just last week or the week before, there's an announcement that the Financial Action Task Force had grade listed us, and we were blacklisted elsewhere because they felt we were not in accord with what they desire. The minister has said it is they who have made the change on us, because they now take our economic situation into account and say we have graduated. But the reality is that we are blacklisted, we are grey listed, we are seen in a negative light in the world, and it is in our hands to correct that. The Bank of Jamaica have said they will seek to complete all the things by next year. But again, we say, you owe it to us legislators to give us a list of the actions that needs to be taken so that we can monitor it. I've said that before. The other point that we want to make, another point we want to make, Minister, is this is part of a global arrangement. And we are compelled to honor these global obligations. But unfortunately, it appears that we are compelled, but others are at will to disregard the global arrangements. I speak, for example, of the WHO, an agency that has given us good guidance in this hour of difficulty of COVID. But others in the world feel free to withdraw funds, financial support from the WHO, to threaten to leave the WHO, and to leave the world in a worse place. And to leave the world in a worse place because health affects our economy, and our economy affects the Financial Action Task Force activity. So I want to know, are these global arrangements, is the assessment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that these global arrangements, climate change, all of these things can withstand the hostility of one of the world's key players? Can make no bones about it. The attitude against WHO is an hostile act against all the people of the world, and in particular the poorer countries of the world. It's not something we should condone, something we should speak out against.
Senator Brown, you could have used the next forum to speak about that still in
Mr. President, this is the forum I have. And it's
I know this is the forum you have, but to talk about the WHO and some hostile...
I'm speaking about... Mr. President, I'm speaking about global arrangements.
Brown, hear me. Just address the legislation or the motion.
Mr. President, maybe you are limited in understanding that this is part of a global arrangement. And I am speaking to global arrangements that we are going into, we are becoming part of, which may very well be tenuous.
Hear this now. My limited understanding of it, I accept my limited understanding of everything except the standing orders. So stick to the standing orders.
And that's what I'm doing. And that's what I'm doing. What we're looking at, the Minister of Finance of Jamaica, in respect to the grey listing of our country, because of our non-fulfillment of the Financial Action Task Force obligations. I said that this is because of a change in our economic status. The minister said in 2019, FATF arbitrarily changed this measure to what is known, Senator Andre, as M3, which is a broader measure of the economy. This arbitrary change meant that for the first time Jamaica exceeded the US $5 billion threshold. So there's a connection to how global arrangements operate. And this disorder we have. And it is our duty as opposition to point out to the government the need to make sure the economic things are in sync. And in this respect, President, given what the minister have said, and given the impact of COVID on the country, and the calamity that faces our economic reality, we need to find out whether or not the prediction by the governor of the Bank of Jamaica, where he has moved from a negative 3% decline in the economy for this year to 4 to 7% decline, and specifically saying we're at 5.1, whether that will change the status of Jamaica under the FATF situation, under the Financial Task Force situation. And would that mean that Jamaica would no longer be grey listed or blacklisted? So, Mr. President, you may not see the connection to the severe economic pressures we face. Severe economic pressures which will show up in poverty, greater poverty, up in great unemployment, which is showing up in greater hardship for the people. I see the need to support us fulfilling the obligations that this order asks. But I also want to know whether or not the serious economic reality that faces us, and for which the government has not been addressing sufficiently, You have focused on the public health side. But beyond the public health, there's a serious economic reality of increased poverty, increased unemployment, increased crime, increased hardship on our people. And I wonder if all of that is taken into account when we look at our obligations to the FATF. The reality, as I close, Mr. President, is our people are suffering. Suffering psychologically, Senator Crawford. Whether they be on the ship or off the ship, the psychological impact is rough on our people. And the economic hardship is great. May it please you, Mr. President. And I'm through before 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, certainly the... Yes, Mr. President, the government is seized of the importance of the issue, and the Minister of Finance has spoken on this on several occasions, and indeed the detailed action plan that has been established for to ensure that all the relevant ministries, departments, and agencies are able to implement the action plan by September 2021 is being monitored by a task force chaired by the, overseen by the Bank of Jamaica, chaired by the Minister of Finance himself, and they are working assiduously on these matters already. I want to just say in respect of the economy and the importance of the management of economy and crime, etc., certainly the government has established the Economic Task Force, which is populated by a broad base of stakeholders and business persons and government, as well as a new economy task force, which focuses more on the digital side of opportunities which lie perhaps untapped. We know, Mr. President, as we have already discussed, that crime is down, and the government's eye continues to be down by 17%, I understand. There are no elements of crime which are up, and that is certainly the silver lining in the cloud of COVID. And the government, however, continues, and the Prime Minister remains as chair of the National Security Council, which sits and which continues to do the work to ensure that we are able to leverage the gains that are being achieved at this time, and so that they do not, in fact, that we don't lose them and lose the opportunities that present themselves. So, Mr. President, acknowledging that both the opposition and the government are in support of this order, I ask that we move for the affirmation thereof.
Membership have heard the question. Those in favor? Against? Senator Williams.
Mr. President, I now ask for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motions, notice of which I gave earlier.
Very professionally done there, Senator Williams. Those in favor? Against?
Okay, yeah. Mr. President, I now move that the motions, notice of which I gave earlier, be approved.
Motions that we are dealing with. The first, those in favor? Aye. Against? And the second motion, those in favor? Aye. Against? Well done, Senator Williams. Thank you. Just before I call on the minister, I just make mention of the passing of Mr. Oliver Clark, OJ. The tongue of good report has been heard on his behalf across the media landscape, and I would ask the clerk to write to Mrs. Clark and his family, indicating that the Senate has observed his passing and offering our sincere condolences. And finally, Monday is being celebrated as, Senator Morris, you wanted to say something? You may, if you wish.
President, I would want to join with you and your expressions on behalf of the opposition, and I want to say how much I recall. I think it was 2002 thereabout, when he was appointed by the then Prime Minister Patterson to chair the special committee to look at the whole issue of working conditions for parliamentarians, because it was much more than looking at the salary. And one of the things coming out of the recommendation from him was to ensure that we have proper parliamentary facilities to accommodate the sittings of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, because I was one of those members who appeared before him on behalf of the Senate, Mr. President. And I tell you, he was shocked and appalled to hear and learn of the circumstances under which the parliamentarians were operating. And, you know, he made some very strong recommendations for corrective actions. And, you know, I know that the new parliamentary building is in train, or the process has started for that, but I think it would do us a great deal, because COVID has manifested that we really need a parliament, you know, to accommodate all the sittings of the Honourable Parliament. And those recommendations were long contained in the report from the Honourable Oliver Clark, and we want to express our profound condolences to this outstanding Jamaican who has given selfless service to his country, and we want to ensure that we join with you in transmitting those expressions to his wife and family. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Morris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, certainly on behalf of this side, we join our words and hearts and thoughts with those expressed by you and Senator Morris. Certainly, Oliver Clark was a giant among the business community, of the business community, and one who had a deep and abiding interest in all matters related to Jamaica and the betterment of Jamaica. I will say on a personal note that as of my appointment, certainly he sought to not only express an interest in matters related to foreign affairs, but he always sought to give an opportunity for the sharing of discussions or opportunities to discuss sensitive issues within small groupings that were appropriate for sensitization of matters that were important to Jamaica and Jamaican foreign policy to ensure a broader understanding of issues that perhaps were too sensitive to deal with in the public domain. And I always appreciated that because it showed a recognition of the sensitivity of the portfolio, but also his recognition of how important it was that if you had the opportunity to play a part in the careful and curated sharing of information, then this was also a part of our democracy to be celebrated. And he, Mr. President, as I said, he was a great man. He'll be well remembered. And we too on this side add our prayers for comfort and strength to Monica, to his family at large, to his daughter, and we wish them every comfort in prayer that they may find. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, please pen the appropriate missive conveying the sentiments of the Senate to his widow and family generally. The other observation I make is that Monday is being celebrated as Labor Day. I think Saturday is the official day. It is a day which used to be referred to as May Day, elsewhere that we know about. But it's a time, I think, when we recognize the workers of the country. And I'm not inviting any comment from Senator Brown or Senator Gale, but we just remember on Monday the workers of the country and the tremendous sacrifice that our union leaders have made over these many years of our independence and prior to independence. So we remember them. And I noticed that Mr. Shearer's birthday was celebrated recently, talking about union leaders. Madam?
Mr. President, it is not intended to do any further business today. I therefore ask for the Senate to be adjourned for a date to be fixed.
The question is that the Senate be adjourned to a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Against? This Honourable Senate now stands adjourned.